So welcome to Larry and Cheryl Elman. What an absolute privilege to not only speak to you today, but to have connected with you in such a lovely way over the last few days. So thank you very much for welcoming me to the US. You've been wonderful hosts. So Larry, tell me, what was the defining moment for you to decide that you were to become a hypnotherapist?
Well, remember that there's two separate ones. One is when I decided to take my father's course, which is when I decided that I wanted to when I was about 10. I took it when I was 11. And the other is, when did I decide to get back into it, because I had other careers in between. The decision to initially take my father's course was a combination of admiration for Dad,
Yeah.
and interest in the subject, because it would be discussed around the dinner table and just was interesting. So the decision was one that I guess was serious for a pre-adolescent, but
Yeah.
would be like any pre-adolescent decision.
Yeah.
As for the other, because of my commitments in both the military and the defense industries, my active participation in hypnosis was not present for several decades. Doesn't mean I forgot about it or didn't observe it.
Yeah.
It means I could not do anything publicly. So when I was asked to answer questions about my father, I would of course do so, and I had a fairly steady correspondence of people asking questions. And then when Sean Michael Andrews came down to interview me, he talked me into making my comments on Dad public. And by the time I had given a speech or two on Dad, I was back in the business, so to speak.
Okay. All right. Wonderful.
I think what made that decision in part right then was the fact that I went to speak in front of a very large and sophisticated group of hypnotists, only to find out that what Dad had taught me was still cutting edge.
Yeah.
And it still being cutting edge 60 years later was, holy smoke.
Yeah.
So it was natural to go back into it at that point.
Good.
I had actually been hypnotized 16 years earlier to stop smoking and stop smoking that way. My background is I had a degree in education, on special education, and I had some experience with psychology. And when I met Don, or Sean Michael Andrews, when he was interviewing Larry, and I came down and he stuck my hand to my head and stuck my hand to the table, and I went, I want to do this. Where can I learn this? And I became his student. So I liked it very much. I had a mobile arts and craft company at the time, and so my background is in education, in sales and marketing and business administration in New York for a couple of companies. And I was an artist, and I had this art company down in Florida and then in North Carolina, and I just really took to it. I enjoyed it so much. Okay. So it became like a culmination of bringing several things together, because I think when you're an artist and you have a creative sense, it's very easy to move that into hypnosis, because you just become connected with that person and you're very client-centered.
Yeah.
And so you can very easily use that creativity in your sessions with your clients.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. And I'd like to ask each of you one more question. We'll start with Cheryl. Cheryl, with the hypnotherapists that are starting out today, they're full of their own uncertainties, they're full of their own limiting beliefs about what they can do and what they can't. What would be something that they need to know which you could tell them perhaps?
It's not just in hypnosis, I remember as a teacher. You go through student teaching, you go through all your classes, and then comes that first day that you're alone with your classes. And I think that's the same for almost every, almost any kind of job that you're starting, and maybe you found that was similar in engineering when you started projects. But I think that just knowing that you have a lot of skills, and it does keep getting better and stronger, and there always has to be a starting point. I think all hypnotists wish in a way that they could take their first clients and do do-overs.
Yeah.
You know, and even when you've been doing it for years, if you record yourself and you listen to your session, it's so much easier to say, wow, if I'd only thought of this, or wow, if I'd only thought of that. And so all you do is keep learning from it. So you learn from the experience, just know that, you know, you're doing some good, and it's going to keep getting better.
Yeah.
So just, and build that confidence.
Wonderful, thank you.
One thing I always tell my students is that they will learn more in their first dozen real people than they have in any course they've taken.
Absolutely.
And one of the reasons for this, and I suspect it's true in other professions, not just in hypnosis, at least that's been my experience, is that when you're in class, or when you're in a course, and you're asked to demonstrate an induction or demonstrate an emergence or whatever, you're following a planned script. Even if it's extemporaneous, it's still a planned script that you've gotten from somebody else.
Yeah.
And the person you're working on, because they're going to be doing it to you next, with just as many people watching or cameras or whatever, will be very compliant,
Yes.
and so on and so forth. You get out to actual people, and they may or may not be so compliant. And if they just so much as twitch, you weren't expecting it, you get this, ah! And so your first dozen clients, because suddenly you realize, I have got to be client-centered. When my instructor told me that, they weren't kidding. I've got to watch everything.
Yeah.
Suddenly it hits you. And so, yeah, your first several be very important to you.
I love that client-focused way of thinking, because when we're thinking about what we're doing as opposed to what is happening with the client, we're not as helpful. I find that I do my best work when I'm almost I probably am in trance myself, and the words just come out, and I don't even know how they come out. It almost seems like it's just automatic.
Right.
But when I'm thinking too much, and I'm thinking about this or that or the other, I don't get that same effect.
I think when I was first learning, I remember listening to a hypnotist named John Weir, and he said, you check yourself at the door.
Yeah.
And check yourself at the door. And I think that's important. I think it's important. I remember I once had a client that for some reason, I must have had a lot going on in my mind, and I just drew a blank. And so there she was in trance, and I just couldn't think of another thing to say. I just couldn't get back to it. And I learned from that experience that now I always have, even if it's just an ego-strengthening script or something in the file or on my clipboard, so if I lose track of it, I just start to pull a couple lines from there, and I go right back into that trance, like similar to you. I just sort of go somewhere, and just allow yourself to do that, and to always go with where the client's at, and doing a good intake. I'd say that's probably one of the most important things. Getting a good feel for that client, because lots of times you get a lot of your script, so to speak, from things that they have said.
Of course.
You know, what their goals are.
Yeah.
Finding out the benefits, their language, absolutely.
We were talking a few moments ago about your feeling on the first few people you work on after training. For me, that had been many, many years in the past, so I knew that intellectually, but I didn't have a recent feel of that. And then I did my first induction using a translator. This was in Switzerland. And I go through standard induction, and everything's going normally, and I get to a point where I am expecting, because it always happens, the person will suddenly go, and nothing happens. And I'm sitting there trying to maintain a straight, slightly smiled face and not move. And I'm mentally counting, what the heck do I do now? One, what the heck do I do now? Two. And I get to about 3 or 4, and something that they go, hmm? And I realized the time delay was the time it took the translator to take my words, put them in the other language, and deliver them to,
Yeah.
which is a perfectly normal, ordinary thing.
Yeah.
But it was the first time I had lived it.
Yeah.
And it brought back, for me, the same feeling that you have when you're just coming out of your first hypnosis certification and you're working with your first client.
And you've got that doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Is this working? Am I doing the right thing?
what
else
did
should
I
be
do
doing?
wrong now?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that 4 seconds was really a bath in ice water, but I'm glad of it, because up to then, if I described this process to my students, I described it intellectually because I knew it. The 3 of us have just described it, and all 3 of us have the same view of it. But now I was describing it with the emotion of recent experience, and it's different.
Of course.
So that was a very lucky thing to have happen.
Yeah. And what's wonderful about both those stories is that here we have, 2 people who are very competent, and to say the least, and we've got doubts still.
Right.
They're resolved, but there's still doubts there, and there's doubts there.
Right, human. And one of the things I will also say to you is keep learning. I love when we have classes or when we attend other classes and I find people that have been in hypnosis 20, 30, 35 years, 40 years, still in that class, still looking and taking notes.
Yes.
And I have to say that in itself just keeps you fresh, getting new ideas. Maybe they're things you've heard and have forgotten and didn't use. Keep that toolbox, your toolkit, full, because you never know if there's things that you might take out once a year, once every other year.
Yeah.
And keep getting new ideas. Network with people. Become involved. And network with the positive people. If you're somewhere, go to conferences, and people are just really negative, stay with positive energy,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that follows through with you and your own practice.
Amen to that. The Elmans, both Cheryl and Larry, are so incredibly generous. It is now past midnight, and here they are. They've taught today, they've presented today. We've gone out for dinner and come back.
And presenting tomorrow.
And presenting tomorrow, and they've given me this time to share with you. So my heart is just so warm from their generosity, from their love. I'm really grateful. Thank you both.